Now, I know a lot of times I post videos, and they're for entertainment purposes. And I talk about uncomfortable situations I've been through surrounding mental health, hard drug addiction, homelessness, being in jail and prison. And it has a satirical element, and it's for entertainment. It's like, damn, honey, we're dope fiends, but that guy is a junkie. Look how bad he is. Oh my god. Like, I'm pretty much a jester, self-deprecating, like, juggle, bitch. I'm like, okay, am I funny? Like, look at that loser. And, like, I'm cool with that. Pays my bills. I don't care. But you guys need to remember that before all that, I was a best-selling author. And I was also a prison reform activist. And a lot of people have been asking me about what I think jail and prisons' responses are going to be surrounding the coronavirus. And I also got this guy on Patreon. He's pretty much attacking me, like telling me that I blame my issues on prison and I don't own up to them, which I don't know how that could be misconstrued. I'm constantly saying that I know that what I did was wrong. I was a drug dealer. I'm a convicted pimp. I don't have any moral delusion about the things that I've done. My point has been, I think that the societal response to the crimes that I've committed have been wrong. Our policies are fallacious. I think that we focus on warehousing nonviolent drug offenders and the mentally ill, and we have very little emphasis on rehabilitation. So this video is going to be about the prison industrial complex. It's going to be a little more pseudo-intellectual than, my normal videos, because I think I'm so smart. And this isn't going to be funny. This is going to be just straight up. This is my idealism. This is what I would talk about if the camera wasn't on, if I was just talking to my friends about it. And let me preface this with saying that I no longer believe in partisan politics, and I don't want to polarize my audience by going on political rants, but I think it's important for people to know my political background and my upbringing. I was raised in the upper middle class in Santa Barbara, California. Basically, a spoiled little bitch that was insulated in this safety bubble, and I had a very abstract understanding of just how violent and combative the world around me outside of that bubble truly was, because I was in a higher socioeconomical tier than, say, somebody in the ghettos of Los Angeles or New York or, parts of Detroit, Chicago. And I really just didn't understand the way that the world worked. I was raised a liberal Democrat. I was indoctrinated with the tenets of progressivism. And as a little kid, I was like, Bill Clinton's the best president ever. He plays saxophone. He likes black people. He got his dick sucked. This dude's awesome. I was a little skater kid in the 90s. Of course I thought that shit was cool. I was like, go, dude. And, and then as I got older, I was behind Kerry and Al Gore. And then when Obama came, I was like, I thought he was the liberal messiah. And I was all about it. I drank the Kool-Aid. I did volunteer work. I used to go door to door in Isla Vista, which is this college town in Santa Barbara, and I'd be like, hey, I'm here with Rock the Vote. I'm just trying to get you to, sign up to be involved with the election process this November. And people would, like, go to slam the door in my face, and I'd, like, pull out an 8-ball of Coke, and I'd be like, I got leñas. What's up? They'd be like, come on in. And we get all coked out, and I'd be telling them all about why they should vote for Obama. Then I went to prison. I got sentenced to 5 years for selling drugs. I sold heroin, which is a drug that destroyed my life. And I fully understand it's how much of a pollutant it is to any community that it's introduced to. And if you're perpetuating an epidemic, it's not a good thing. It destroys lives. And I understand that, and it's illegal. I can own up to the fact that I made a mistake, and I do feel bad about it. I did it because I was a drug addict, and I did it to sustain my addiction, and I thought that that was the more passive approach. And so I had friends that were going around robbing liquor stores at gunpoint. I was like, well, I'm not that bad. I'm just going to slang this shit. But, how many lives did I destroy in that process? Who knows? So I willingly committed a crime. And, so when I got sentenced to 5 years in federal prison, I wasn't mad at the system because I already knew that the system was in place and I chose to break it anyway. Now, I think that it's important to examine the prison industrial complex, mandatory minimum sentences, and what's wrong with mass incarceration, and how we're at a unique time now with the coronavirus pandemic, and how we can expedite the end of mass incarceration and why we should. Before anything, I know what I did was wrong. I own up to it. But I also think that the way that I was warehoused, with violent offenders, and essentially turned into a much more aggressive, violent person because of it, by symbiosis, or by osmosis, not symbiosis. I think that that's patently wrong. There weren't rehabilitative efforts made at all. So let's talk about the prison industrial complex first. Let me just explain what that is, why it's wrong, how we got in this mess of mass incarceration to begin with. You can trace it back to its inception, and it's always been in a capitalistic society. Prisons are used often incorrectly for the oligarchs to oppress certain lower socioeconomical tiers, what they consider the dangerous classes. But we know that dangerous classes to them means African American, Hispanic, and it's very prejudiced, and it's aimed at perpetuating social immobility. So we have a collective short memory in the United States. So let's start with the 1980s until now. We don't need to go back to the origins. This is something I've studied in depth. When I went to prison, I read anarchistic literature. I also read a lot of Noam Chomsky, who identifies as a libertarian socialist, which most people go, well, that's paradoxical. Socialism and libertarianism is two different sides of the spectrum. It's two different, it's polar opposites of the continuum. Well, maybe in the contemporary political lexicon, that verbiage has been distorted, it's been perverted, and we have a contemporary understanding of what liberal and what conservative means, what libertarian means, socialist, what anarchist means. But Noam Chomsky, who identifies as that, knows what the roots of these meanings are and what those ideological bodies actually stand for. So, in my opinion, and by the way, when I read all that stuff, the status quo would say that I was radicalized, as if, any opposition to the oligarch status quo it meant that I'm some sort of extremist, and the media definitely continues to perpetuate these myths and these illusions. I became very disenchanted. I became very disillusioned by partisan politics and by the political continuum as a whole. But so in the 1980s, we saw the rise of neoliberalism. The way that I interpret that is, I think that we're a centrist country for a time. FDR was a democratic socialist. He's the one that was advocating for the entitlement programs. He started a lot of the popular ones, Social Security, in Medicare. All these popular entitlement programs are essentially democratic socialism. Now, in a free enterprise society, which is what we are, the United States is a republic, so we have an indirect democracy. And if there's any democratic socialism going on, it's running within the confines of capitalism. So it's not socialism in the Venezuela sense of socialism. It's very different. But, of course, that's misconstrued, and mainstream media tries to vilify it. But that doesn't matter. Neoliberalism turned this country from centrist into a lot further right. So we became a right-wing country, I'd say right around when neoliberalism consolidated the political continuum. Democrats, Republican, it all became the same fucking thing because corporations had amassed so much power and wealth, and so had certain individuals, that we were run under a corporate agenda. So instead of us electing politicians and then the politicians making decisions on behalf of their constituents, they were making decisions based on special interest groups and lobbyists because the corporations started to control the government. We were corporately run, and if that goes on, if unfettered capitalism gets too out of control, and we start getting dictated by corporations in its totality. So corporations by nature can be tyrannical. They can be totalitarian. They can be authoritarian as corporations, but we often don't look at them and the government as synonymous. Once it becomes complete corporate totalitarianism, it's fascism. Now, a lot of people are familiar with these words, with these terms, with these different ideological sets, but they don't realize how it affected us and what it has to do with the prison industrial complex. And we're very much moving more and more towards an oligarchic fascist state. It's becoming a police state. And it's going to be very telling to see what happens with the coronavirus. But anyway, back to the 1980s, when neoliberalism started to consolidate those sides, we saw a big change in the way that the prison industrial complex was working. Now, if you look at crime rates, in the 1970s, there was a big spike, but they started going down. Down, and then in the early 1990s, in my opinion, what was the result of police opposition and civil unrest? There was the riots. A lot of bad stuff happened in the early 90s. Crime spiked for momentarily, and then it subsided. And if you look at crime from 1993 until now, violent crimes have almost been cut in half. And that's not distorted numbers. That's what the FBI is putting out for their statistics. And I think the only thing that's happened is there's been a perception shift because social media, all media for that matter, has become more ubiquitous. And fear, hysteria, translates to numbers. So the media started making us feel like we were more unsafe. We actually have politicians that talk about how hard they are on crime, which is insane. Nobody else in industrialized nations are doing that. There's no other campaign platforms in France where they're talking about how hard they are on crime. That's complete weirdo, United States imperialistic ideals. It's very, very strange because that's what we are. We are imperialists. So crime spiked in 1970s and then it started to subside. But what happened is in the 1980s, when neoliberalism started to come into play in the political arena in the United States, they started having think tanks that found ways to essentially enslave these lower socioeconomical tiers. Let's just look at mandatory minimum sentencing, which came into vogue and came into law in the early 1980s. Joe Biden, who's for sure a faux progressive, was one of the leading proponents of this. And he started making mandatory minimum sentences, which led to a mass proliferation in building prisons and also the prison population. Until the early 1980s, we had our numbers were essentially, the same as other industrialized countries. And once they started doing the mandatory minimum sentences, you just saw this huge influx, this huge surge of mass incarceration. And look at what the laws are, and look at how those laws are designed to oppress specific minorities. So let's look at simple drug possession. Simple drug possession. First of all, mandatory minimum sentences, just in case if you don't have a rudimentary understanding of how this stuff works, mandatory minimum sentences mean that you get caught with a certain amount of weight. So I got arrested with a little under a half pound of heroin, 224 grams or something. And the mandatory minimum for that was 5 to 40 years. So there was a mandatory minimum of 5 years. I could not get below 5 years unless I cooperated, unless I turned into some sort of informant and testified against somebody or gave the law some sort of information. But if I didn't do that, I had to do 5 years. And I ultimately did do 5 years. And there's no mitigating factors involved with that. So that's saying that no matter what, the outside circumstances don't matter. They don't come into play. It doesn't matter why I had a half pound. It doesn't matter that I was a drug addict and I was doing it to sustain my addiction. Even though the American Medical Association classifies addiction as a disease. So it is a disease. And why is it a disease? Because it has the same symptoms that make up a disease apparatus. It's progressive. Addiction is progressive, and it's ultimately terminal. You will die from it if you do not address it, but it's also manageable. It's manageable, it's progressive, and it's terminal. So if you can manage this disease, it doesn't become terminal. So the fact that it's a disease and that there's people that are selling drugs to sustain their habit would certainly fall under a compelling mitigating circumstance. Meaning that if I get caught with a half pound of heroin because I'm truly sick with addiction, if I don't have more heroin, I'm going to be sick. So I'm selling it, even though it's a crime. I know it's a crime. So there should be a consequence for it. But should my consequence be the same as somebody that's not a drug addict, that's selling the same drug that's destroying lives, not to support the destruction of his own life, just so that he can get the new Air Force Ones or he can get the new Jordans, he can get the new car? Is there a difference, or is it equal? I don't think it's equal. I think if you have mental health issues and you're a drug addict, there should definitely be mitigating circumstances that go into that. Now, what's very interesting about mandatory minimum sentences is drug use for Caucasians had gone down pretty dramatically from the mid 1970s to the early 1980s. So from like 75 to like 81, right around the time that the mandatory minimum sentences were proposed. Addiction had essentially become more drug addiction was much more common for minorities in the ghettos. Now, of course, addiction doesn't discriminate. You can be the richest person in the world and you can be a heroin addict. You can be a homeless guy and you can be a heroin addict. It doesn't matter. What I'm saying is that it was much more common in the ghettos for poor minorities to be addicted to drugs than it was in the upper class, in the upper middle class, the middle class, and the upper class. So they looked at that and they said, okay, these African American and Hispanics are addicted to drugs. Let's make mandatory minimum sentences so that it takes discretionary power away from the judge and it gives unfettered power to the prosecutors. And that's why they started warehousing nonviolent drug offenders that were disproportionately Black or Hispanic. Now, let's look at a simple drug possession. Possession of heroin. Say I have a gram of heroin on me. For a very long time, and still in many states, if you get caught for a simple drug possession, it's a felony. A lot of states you'll go to prison for a simple drug possession. Not anymore in California, but that only changed within the last few years. These draconian drug laws used to, in this state and still in many other states, like I said, would have people serving prison sentences for simple possessions. Now, Jimmy Carter once said, the consequence for a substance should never outweigh, what harm that substance can do to the person, something to that effect. And it's very interesting when you look at this. A simple possession of heroin, I'm hurting myself. Now let's look at a DUI, driving under the influence, or driving while intoxicated, DWI. Those crimes, you are potentially hurting somebody else. By driving drunk, there's a probability that you'll hurt another person. And the simple drug possession is 20 times more severe than a DWI or DUI. And the reason being is because DUIs, DWIs disproportionately, Caucasians from the middle class and upper class are disproportionately arrested for DUIs compared to minorities. That's just one example. Around that time, the crack epidemic had just started destroying the ghettos in this country. Now, I'm friends with Freeway Ricky Ross, and he was kind of the poster child for that in Los Angeles in the 1980s. There's a lot of evidence, not to get too conspiratorial, but there's a lot of evidence that supports the Iran-Contra scandal. There was shadow economy from selling crack in the ghettos that had fueled the Iran-Contra scandal, so that the CIA could arm these oppositional groups. That's pretty well known that Oliver North was involved with all that, and I've had plenty of conversations with Rick, and there's some really weird shit going on in Nicaragua at that time. But I don't want to get too conspiratorial. One thing that's an actual fact that we can look back and we can see that's directly a racist law, it's unequivocally racist, was the crack compared to powder cocaine laws. What they had done during those mandatory minimum sentences is they would start quantifying the different possessions and what there was different numbers for crystal meth. 50 grams or more to this day of crystal meth possession, if possession with intent on the federal level, is 10 years to life in prison. If you get caught with more than 5 grams, between 5 grams and 50 grams of crystal meth, it's 5 to 40 years in prison. A gram of crystal meth is going for $10 on the street. So you're telling me that $500 worth of crystal meth translates to 10 years to life in federal prison? Why? Because that, again, disproportionately affects minorities. And when you look at the crack law, you could get caught with... So the severity of crack compared to powder cocaine was 100 times worse for crack cocaine than powder cocaine. The reason being, because you'd read stories all the time. You read in the Washington Post, you read in the New York Times. This politician got caught with an 8-ball of powder cocaine and a hooker in some convertible in Washington, D.C. Gets probation. A black guy gets caught with 3 grams of crack cocaine in Washington, D.C. and gets 15 years in prison. And it was alarming that the severity of crack cocaine, which is the same substance as cocaine, there's just baking soda added to it. It's the exact same substance. And it was 100 times more severe for the crack, for the version with baking soda than it was just for the powder cocaine. I forget what the guidelines are for powder cocaine, but it's something insane. It was, you could get caught with almost 1,000 grams before you get 10 years. You get caught with 50 grams of crack, you're getting 10 years in prison. 50 grams, which is insane. And, we can look at that, and in retrospect, it's like, wow, that was a very overtly racist law. And they just changed it in 2016. I was in federal prison when Obama pushed it through. And they changed the crack law so that it was tantamount to powder. And what's funny is Joe Biden was he had put his influence into making it not retroactive. So all the people that had been in prison for 50 years already didn't get time credits now that they're saying that it's equal, that crack and powder cocaine are equal. I saw a lot of black guys get released instantly because it targeted blacks, but there was a lot that had been in prison serving life sentences, and because of the retroactive clause of that new legislation, they remained in prison. It was bullshit. So, it's smoking mirrors when they say that they're trying to make some progression in the war on drugs. The war on drugs is a war on minorities, and those are just a few examples of that. We also saw, since 1993, there's been a 1,600% increase in the amount that's been incarcerated, but violent crimes have gone down by 50%. And if you look at mandatory minimums, 80% of people serving sentences in federal prison for mandatory minimum sentences are there for drug crimes, or there's mandatory minimum for gun crimes. There's mandatory minimums for pimping and pandering. There's mandatory minimums when they know that it's more likely to affect minorities. And then you look at major crimes, financial crimes. The 2008 housing market, when that crashed, when we found out that all of these investment banks were involved with all these foreclosure scandals and all these buying faulty credit and basically gambling against people that couldn't pay their mortgage and selling people, essentially trapping the regular people and being able to arbitrarily change their mortgage on them, forcing innumerable people to be foreclosed. None of those people went to prison for mandatory minimums. Hardly anyone went to prison for anything in the financial sector. For major crimes, tax evasion, money laundering, running these crazy scams on people. Now, once in a while, you'll see people like Bernie Madoff get like a life sentence for a huge Ponzi scheme. But look at how many people are getting arrested for financial crimes. Look at the mandatory minimum sentences, and they are completely disproportionate. Drug crimes, gun crimes, stuff that affects gang members, stuff that affects minorities. These crimes have mandatory minimums, but they still have discretionary power when it comes to financial crimes, or when it comes to crimes that you're generally committing by yourself. And one area that the general public has been attentive to and have noticed that there's something very, very wrong is sex crimes. Let's look at sex crimes. There's 3,000 people, I want to say, doing time in federal prison, right? Doing life sentences for first-time nonviolent drug crimes. And then you're looking at pedophiles getting probation or getting very, very light sentences. Look at Brock Turner. It's a great example of this. Brock Turner, if you guys remember, was a student at Stanford, and he was on the swim team, and he was an Olympic prospect. He was the kind of guy that was going to be groomed. He was going to be some Olympic swimmer. He came from all this prestige, white privilege, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I'm not saying that I'm any different. Well, I'm not a fucking rapist, and I didn't go to Stanford, but I had some white privilege as well. But not anymore. Now I'm a 3-time felon. I've been, I'm looked at by the law as a minority now. But Brock Turner was at a party. This girl got a little too drunk, and he dragged her unconscious, passed out body behind a dumpster. He stuck his fingers in her vagina. He took pictures on his phone. And thankfully, some foreign exchange student was riding by on a bike, saw him, and was like, "What the fuck?" and went and beat the shit out of him, held him down, and made sure that the police came and arrested him. For a sexual assault. Brock Turner gets 90 days in prison for that. And the judge said, that he didn't think that it warranted prison because he didn't want, one bad decision to affect the rest of his life. Brock Turner's dad even said something to the effect of, well, I don't think that 5 minutes of action warrants ruining his life or something. That's not verbatim, but something to that effect. 5 minutes of action? Maybe he meant that it was like just a short action, but the way that they're saying it is absolutely deplorable. You don't want to ruin this kid's life by putting him in prison. What about the fucking girl he raped? What about her? What about the victim in it? Did you ever take her feelings into account? Do you know what rape does to somebody? And the reason that rapists, pedophiles, people that commit these sex crimes, the reason that they are not penalized the way that a nonviolent drug offender is because it doesn't affect minorities. It's not a way for the oligarchs to oppress a specific group of people. It's just one person doing it, even though the crimes are deplorable. They are fucking insufferable crimes. But it doesn't help fuel the prison industrial complex's financial strategy, because every prison is a for-profit prison, and these aren't affecting large groups of people. These are individuals, so the laws aren't as hard on them. But you're like, well, what about murderers? They get life sentences. It's there's a lot of murderers that don't get life sentences. There's a lot of murderers that are getting 25 years in prison. There's a lot of nonviolent drug offenders doing life. There's a lot of crystal meth cooks doing 30 years. Well, crystal meth destroyed. Look how many lives they destroy. Look at R.J. Reynolds. Look at McDonald's. Look at trans fat. Look at the obesity epidemic. Look at how much. Look at preventable death. Google that. You know what's preventable death in this country? Tobacco is number one. Alcohol. Obesity might be even above, tobacco, but they have these special interest groups and lobbyists that defend them, so they skew this information with think tanks that make it look like it's something that it's not. Trans fat kills people. Tobacco kills people. Alcohol is one of the most dangerous drugs on the fucking planet. And not only is it not illegal, you see it on TV. You see the guy with the fucking, with the scarf hanging out with hot chicks in the mountain. You're like, man, that looks cool. That looks cooler than what I'm doing, sitting on my couch by myself. I want to hang out with hot chicks in the mountain. Yeah, then you get cirrhosis of the liver. Then you get behind the wheel and you fucking, you get in car accidents. You kill a completely blameless person. It incites violence. How much alcohol-related violence is there out in the free world? Do you know why alcohol in prison is so incredibly illegal and why they triple? Because it compromises the safety of the prison. Because when inmates get drunk, they assault each other and they assault the guards at a much higher rate. So that's why they're so severe if you get caught drunk or making alcohol in American prisons, because it's so unsafe for the guards and for the community. But out here, we have special interest groups and lobbyists advocating for it. We have these people having ads in magazines and on TV. Are you kidding me? And again, it's because we have an oligarchy that is run amok. So we have this prison industrial complex. When the privatization of prisons is the biggest scam that we've ever seen. They're basically saying that it's going to cost taxpayers a lot less. No, it's having taxpayers essentially pay for private prisons. And then, because there's a bottom line, because there's profit incentives, they take shortcuts. Guards safety is compromised. Inmate safety is compromised. There's like a 28% higher assault rate in privatized prisons than ones that aren't because it's for profit directly. They're cutting corners to make those profits, and they are making, concessions in places where concessions shouldn't be made regarding safety. And this is something else that's very interesting if you think about it, because prison industrial complex, I've always said, is emblematical of slavery. Let's look at this for a second. I'm a nonviolent drug offender. I got arrested for conspiracy to distribute heroin. They said that I was part of an international drug cartel from Mexico. Not true. I bought heroin from a fat chick in East LA. That's it. I wasn't part of any organized crime outfit. Not that I knew of. If you trace any drug lineage, it's going to go to some international cartel, And it's like, they put me in a medium security prison in Victorville, California. It has been dubbed Victimville because of how volatile that prison is. It's a very violent prison. People get stabbed there. People get jumped there. People get killed there. It's a very scary place. And they just threw me in there and, hope you don't get more violent. Hope you don't come out with PTSD or, if I wasn't a danger to the community before I went there, I certainly was when I got out, because I was much more aggressive, much more violent, much more crazy. And what's interesting is what I think they have found that education is the number one combatant to recidivism. Recidivism means the rate in which people go back to prison. So you educate people, you expand literacy, you give them vocational training, equip them with job skills, teach them basic life skills, how to balance a checkbook, how credit works, what APR is. Teach them basic life skills before you throw them back and they're inept in the community, because people are getting out there and they don't know what to do. But what's very interesting is Joe Biden again, but several other politicians. It's not to blame the Democrats. It's not to blame the Republicans, because it's all the fucking same side, and they're all doing this. It's all to serve the oligarchy. It's all a mechanism to keep certain portions of the population that are considered dangerous classes, but they're minorities, oppressed. He removed Pell Grants, so you couldn't get college education anymore. Well, we shouldn't be giving it to criminals. Criminals are the people you should be giving education to, because you're turning them into non-fucking criminals. It's common sense. It's completely illogical that you would not equip convicts with education. You're already stigmatizing them with a felony. It's almost impossible to get conventional work. You're blemished with societal stigma of a felony. Then you can't get orthodox employment as easily. At least give people an opportunity to have some social mobility. Give them education. But on top of that, which I find interesting, is when sex offenders go to prison, they go to state prison, they put them in protective custody to protect them, because they know that general population is going to prey on sex offenders. And we won't want that. We won't want the sex offenders to get beat up or worse, or killed. So you're willing to protect sex offenders from violence in protective custody, but you're not willing to protect nonviolent drug offenders. So what you're doing is you are cultivating an entire new social defect. You're handicapping nonviolent drug offenders with aggression, with the inability to adapt once they get out, and now they've been exposed to violence. But you'll protect the pedophiles? What the fuck is up with that? And it's because they want to perpetuate that immobility. It's the truth. That's what's going on. And I mean, it's all nuts to me. Mass incarceration is one of the biggest problems that we have, because it keeps the poor, and it doesn't allow, it doesn't allow people to be rehabilitated. So now we're in a crisis with a global pandemic. And ACLU, humanitarian groups, prison reform activists, such as myself, are calling for accelerated and expedited prison reform. Let people out. Let the nonviolent offenders out. Don't let the rapists out. Don't let the pedophiles. Don't let people that are considered a danger to the community out. But there are people in prison right now for selling marijuana. They are going to be in a place where it acts as an incubator for this virus, and there is a very high probability, not just possibility, a probability that if you were incarcerated right now, the virus will spread like wildfire and you will die. People that are in prison right now for solely selling marijuana don't deserve to die. Not when California just deemed it an essential business. They've closed nightclubs, they've closed bars, they've closed fucking salons, places to get your hair cut, your nails done, beaches, parks. They're all fucking closed, except for grocery stores, banks, gas stations, essential businesses. Marijuana is considered an essential business. I agree. I think that marijuana is amazing. I think that it helps people with depression, helps with epilepsy. There's a myriad medicinal purposes for marijuana. And I'm all for it. I'm a marijuana advocate. Marijuana is good. You know, it is good for society. I would much rather have people stoned than drunk in a time of crisis, because being stoned makes you more passive, it chills you out, and it makes you nicer. It's a fact. Alcohol does the complete opposite. But you're going to tell me that marijuana is considered an essential business in California, but there's still people serving prison sentences in other parts of the country for marijuana? It's all about money. It's all about the oligarch. And what I think that's happening right now in prison is that, everyone's locked down, and I don't think they know what to do. And there's going to be people that's saying that it's a public, it can affect the public negatively. Well, if we suddenly release a bunch of convicts into society, I heard someone say this on Instagram. We can't have that. We can't have rapists and murderers released back into the community. Well, of course the media is going to, propagate that hysteria. Of course, that's what they do because they make money off of it. They make money off fear-mongering. Fact. Watch TV. You watch the news, 90% of it is how horrible the world is, how you should be petrified. And then they'll show and then there's this guy in Louisiana, he's giving away kittens right now for his school. They'll throw one little nice benevolent thing in there. The rest of it is to terrify us. And what I had to say to this guy on Instagram is I said, listen, this is complete misinformation that you are saying. It's just completely baseless. They're not going to release rapists. They're not going to release murderers. They're going to release non-violent offenders that don't deserve to be there. And this person's rebuttal was, well, what if they became violent in prison? Maybe they went in there non-violent and maybe they're not. Exactly why they shouldn't be in there in the first place. And no, they're not going to get out of prison and just go commit a bunch of crimes right now. I guarantee you anybody that they release is going to be so grateful to God that they're out of prison, that they're going to go be with their families. They're going to go be with their kids. They're going to go be with their wives. They're going to go be with their parents. They're going to be grateful and they're going to be happy. Nonviolent offenders, drug offenders specifically. Drug addiction is a disease. It is a medical problem that deserves a medical solution. Prison, criminalizing it, the criminality that goes with addiction makes addiction much worse. And it serves no good for society as a whole. If we want to affect change, major things need to happen. Redistribution of wealth. We need to help each other. Unity. You're going to see things become more socialistic now. But this isn't about that. This is just about one evil tentacle in the oligarch the prison industrial complex. And while people are locked down, while they're releasing people from jails, they need to consider people that are trapped in federal prison and state prison, and you need to seriously consider and reshape policy right now. Who deserves to be in prison and who doesn't? If you say somebody deserves to die, then they probably deserve to be in prison. Rapists should not be allowed to be free. They shouldn't. And by the way, as violent crimes decrease, there's one crime that has gone up, and that's rape. The numbers of sexual assaults have gone up exponentially, while the number of violent crimes have gone down. And they don't even categorize rape as a violent crime. I don't know what universe we're living in where rape or sexual assault's not considered violent. Brock Turner, for dragging an unconscious girl behind a dumpster, deserved to go to prison for 25 years, in my opinion. Because for 25 years, if not longer, probably the rest of her life, we can say, unequivocally, that piece of shit is going to affect her. So 3 months in county jail in isolation is not enough for somebody like that. I think we can all agree that we need to end the war on drugs, the war on minorities, the war on dangerous classes, the war on the poor, and we need to wage one on violent offenders, drug offenders. Let me tell you something. The war on drugs, that they're this mass incarceration. You've seen the prison population increase by 1,600% since 93 because of, mandatory minimum laws. You know how you wage a war on drugs? The same way that you wage a war on Afghanistan, Iraq. You have an issue with drug addiction and drugs coming into this country, go to war with the fucking cartels that are bringing them here. Go to Mexico and start a war like you would any war. Go to South America, start a war like you would with any war. Colombia, places where these illicit drugs are being manufactured. Of course they're not going to do that. Of course they're not going to do that, because that could stop it. And they don't want it to be stopped because we're an oligarchy and we monopolize this. We stand to, it's more advantageous monetarily if it's illegal because we profit on both sides of it. And my personal opinion to end this video, well, what's the solution? The solution is to, advocate rehabilitation over incarceration. Adopt some of the same strategies that we've done in Portugal. Legalize all drugs. Fentanyl's killing people right now. That's an adulterant that is put into our heroin. If drugs were regulated, we would stop communicable diseases. We would greatly be able to manage accidental overdoses. We make Narcan available to everyone. We start giving opioid antagonist treatment to people to get out of prison. If you're at a predisposition, if you're addicted to heroin, if you're addicted to painkillers, and you have to go to jail for some reason, you should be awarded early release time if you sign up for Vivitrol, or you sign up for some sort of Sublocade, some long-lasting shot that's not going to allow you to use the opiate, which, if you trace back me, anytime I've ever been in trouble, anytime, either directly or obliquely, it has been because of my drug addiction, my addiction to opiates specifically. That's what I would do. Legalize, regulate, and, let's start addressing this with some compassion. There's a number of people that don't deserve to be in prison right now. Educate, rehabilitate, stop locking people up for crimes they don't deserve to be in jail for. Give them treatment, because everybody deserves a shot at life. And if you're a danger to the community, if you're a rapist, if you're a murderer, if you're doing armed robberies, if you're hurting people, you deserve to be incarcerated. But if we only incarcerated people like that, these for-profit prisons would just implode. And it's not just privatized prisons either. Every prison is for profit. The labor unions, the correctional officers, the small desolate towns whose monetary ecosystem is dependent on the prison towns, Soledad, Chino, Wasco. Look at all of these towns that would be financially devastated without the prisons being located in them. So to fuel those individual communities, they have to keep people in prison for things that people don't deserve to be in prison for. That's why we have mass incarceration. That's why we warehouse nonviolent drug offenders and the mentally ill. It's disgusting. It's deplorable. Just one of the many, many evils of an unregulated, unfettered oligarchy. And no, I'm not on cocaine. Palabra.